Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Zubin. I'm here with a special guest, Professor Pierce Salguero. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
I just love saying professor because it makes everything so hoity-toity, you know?
Yeah, I do have, I research in this area that we're going to be talking about, and I do have a lot of sort of professional activities in this area. But I think I'm mostly here as an individual person, not in my capacity as a professor, but just sort of as an individual in this particular context. So
that's perfect. That's perfect because what that brings me in is to the intro of why we're talking. So we became friends because a friend of mine introduced me to a model, a map of the kind of awakening process that you were proposing. And it's funny because, you know, as a former academic myself, I have a lot of sympathy to models and maps and ontologies and things like that. But this is something a little different. What I found is it was a huge relief, like personally. And then I told other people about it in a show that I did that was titled something like "Your Awakening Won't Fit Their Mold." And of course, there is no "your awakening." All of this is kind of a way of speaking, but the idea that the emergence of this process of awakening, where we start to see reality more and more precisely and clearly for what it seems to be, although even that starts to fall away. There are so many dogmas around how that goes. So if you're a Buddhist, it's all about this idea everything is empty of any real substance or meaning. If you're a Christian or a mystical Christian or a Sufi, you might say it's all about God and love and this divine unity. If you're a yogi or someone who practices particular traditions of martial arts, you might say it's all about the flow of energy. It's all about this sort of thing. And everybody has this different sort of view. And it seems like, especially now that everything's been democratized on YouTube and you can watch somebody talk about this, each person seems to make it about that aspect that shows up loudest for them, or in their tradition, the main focus of the tradition. And it feels really alienating to a lot of people who might be experiencing different aspects of this that have nothing to do with the empty nature of reality. It might feel like all divine love, or it might be that ancestors are talking to them, or rocks are talking to them, or they might have had a psychedelic experience that exposed something in their unconscious or in their trauma. And they don't have a way of putting that in context. And it can be very frustrating. They can feel either like they're broken or they're going down the wrong path. Or worse, if they're part of a tradition, the tradition might say, you know, this is all just illusion. Like in Zen, they really focus on this idea of emptiness. So if you have a lot of unconscious stuff coming up or a lot of love, divinity feeling, they'll say that's makyo, that's illusion. Just focus on the fact that there's nothing really going on or there's no self. And that can be very, very upsetting to people who are having their own unfolding. It is unique to them. No two people seem to wake up in the same way. So when I read about your model and I watched a little talk you gave, I was blown away. I was like, whoa, this is another map. And the maps never really describe the territory. Just like when you look at a globe, you're not seeing the earth, you're seeing an abstraction. But this particular abstraction that you came up with, this threads of awakening model, seemed to fit my own experiences so much more tightly than anything else that I'd seen. And then when I talked about it publicly, a lot of people weighed in and said, oh, finally, yes, yeah, I had that and I didn't know what it was. I discounted it. And in some ways, I maybe even tried to abort it because it didn't make sense. So that long-winded introduction is my way of saying I'm really excited to bring a different way of looking at awakening to the world so that they can, again, people can realize, hey, we all do this in our own way and it's okay and it's valid. What you're going through is valid. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's both a great sort of summary of the overall perspective, but it's also, you're getting right at the reason that I developed this model in the first place. Both myself, as somebody who's had a lot of experience with a lot of different kinds of spiritual traditions, a lot of different kinds of spiritual experiences and so forth, and not really fitting into any of the pre-existing models. but then also talking to others who have that same experience. And what I noticed was people are really, when they're having spiritual experiences out of context or that don't fit into a framework or a tradition, or they don't have a teacher that's validating those experiences, it's very common for people to turn kind of against themselves, to turn into doubt and to turn into fear and thinking that I'm doing something wrong, something's wrong with me, or that my experiences aren't legitimate, and essentially gaslighting themselves into either, like you said, giving no importance to things, or brushing things under the rug or ignoring them, or even worse, going into severe fear states and things like what people call, spiritual emergency, even, just because they don't have a framework to fit into. And so, after decades of practicing many different traditions, studying many traditions as an academic, talking with lots of people, this model sort of emerged as, I guess, like a meta level theory or meta level kind of description of spiritual awakening process. The goal of which is to have it be something that's maximally flexible, so that the most possible number of people could actually see themselves and interpret their experiences through this model. So that being said, it's just a model. It's just another way of kind of approaching this topic through a different lens, through a different kind of approach. I would say the fundamental difference between my model and virtually all of the other models that I'm aware of is whether it's the ox herding pictures from Zen, or it's the stages of insight from Theravada, or it's the levels of consciousness from TM, or whatever system. Those systems tend to speak in terms of stages that happen sequentially, like stage 1 leads to stage 2, leads to stage 3, leads to stage 4, and they sort of slice up the process in a particular way. I think of, like vertical kind of boxes that you're located in as you travel down this trajectory. And this model slices things differently. So it's looking at threads that run throughout the entire process, and those threads can interweave with one another. You can move up and down different places on the thread as you gradually work towards the deeper end of the thread. So it doesn't really require fixed boxes or fixed locations or stages. Rather, it can accommodate a lot of fluidity, a lot of flexibility in the model for understanding how your experiences are unfolding. And I just find personally, and also a lot of people that I speak to, respond better to this more kind of capacious, more flexible way of thinking. But that's not to say that it's the truth, and it's not to say that it's right for everybody either. So if you're getting a lot of value out of a stage-based model of awakening, and it's really explanatory for you and helpful for you, great, use that. There's no reason to look for something else. But this model is for people who are struggling with the existing paradigms, the existing descriptions of the awakening process that don't seem to be fitting into them, and it's just something to try out and see if it might help, if it might be helpful for you.
Perfectly put. Yeah. And I'll put let me go back for a few things there that I think are very important that you mentioned. So one is that there are all these different stages and models of awakening. And again, since everybody's different and the process, in a sense, I can almost say there's no way that reality is, and you're not making any ontological claims about the nature of reality. It's just another descriptive model that says, okay, maybe this might be more helpful for you. Why? Number one, and this is what I've seen in people and in myself, that the standard chronologic stages of awakening models can feel, first of all, like they don't fit. Second of all, like you're not good enough. So then that old egoic self-hate that comes in and says, well, I'm not at stage 3. What stage are you at? Have you had this clarity of insight? What ox herding picture of Zen correlates to you? And then teachers tend to reify this and say, oh, I sense in you the 6th ox herding picture. You're riding the bull going backwards, playing the flute. It's like, what the fuck? Like, that doesn't feel like my internal state. So there's like a disconnect between what's actually experienced and some model that is being maybe even given to you rather than something that you've chosen. But sometimes we choose it and then we try to live up to this model, and it creates all this friction. The second thing you mentioned is spiritual emergencies, or these kind of crises where we might have an experience along a line or a thread of awakening that isn't in the standard model in the way that we might think, or that we've heard of, or that our teachers talked about if we have a teacher. And then suddenly we feel like we're crazy, we're losing our mind, the floor is being pulled out, we're destabilized, we're disoriented, we're dizzy, all the things that can happen. And it can even show up as psychiatric presentations that, people end up 5150 or on psychiatric holds for what is really a spiritual sort of experience. And I use the word spiritual light. It's these kind of experiences that can happen of divine unity or the derealization of everything all at once. There's a million different things that can happen. So having a model that actually is, like you said, capacious, can hold space for all these things, and it's not necessarily chronological in the way that some other models are. It's actually much more, and we'll talk about the nature of it, much more able to hold a lot of different emergence. And then the third thing I want to say is, none of this is necessary. If you're one of those people that just, this stuff is just happening and you don't need a model and the models don't even make sense, there's no need for any of this. This is not necessary. So this is for the kind of folks that we were pointing at just now.
Yeah, that's exactly who this model is for. So it's like I said, it's not for everybody. It's for a very specific portion of the population that is having these experiences that don't fit into a pre-existing traditional model and are looking for some way of explaining what's going on or understanding what's going on. And I guess, the comment that you were just making about the psychiatric context makes me think that perhaps we should have even started at a more basic point, which is just to say, I think it's very well established scientifically, and you probably know more about the medical research than I do on this, or the neurological research on this, but it's very well established that human beings have the ability to have all sorts of unusual experiences, mystical, religious experiences, that of all sorts of different types, of all kinds of different flavors, and that we can provoke those or increase the likelihood that we'll experience those through doing certain kinds of practices. And those practices historically have been carried by traditional religious lineages, and they teach. Each religion teaches a handful or a particular suite of practices that they value, and like you were saying, in this day and age, where all of these traditions and all of these practices are now widely available on the internet, and people are sort of able to play around with all of these different practices, people are discovering that these states are phenomenologically. These states are real. They are actual states that you can experience. What I think happens in the modern period is that people, because you're not practicing these practices within a traditional context, your experiences are often out of sync with your view of reality, your ontology, your view of the world. So within a traditional monoculture, you're living in, Thailand several centuries ago, there's, Theravada Buddhism, and there's not much else in the neighborhood, right? And kind of everybody's participating in the same sort of worldview, in the same kind of cultural context, same social context. The kinds of experiences that you might have would have been understood within a framework by your community, and you would have felt supported with those kinds of experiences. But in the modern period, like you said, we're all sort of this, multilingual, multicultural, global humanity that's borrowing and playing with all of these practices from all over the world. We need to have a framework that is going to be broader, that can accommodate the full breadth and the full spectrum of those kinds of experiences. But what is actually happening is people are adopting rather limited ontologies or rather limited worldviews, and then those aren't matching the sort of range of experiences that they're having. So you might adopt, say, a materialistic scientific worldview, and then suddenly you're experiencing yourself as one with the universe, and this or consciousness is the only thing that's real, or I am God, or any number of different experiences that don't match with your ontology, and that may cause cognitive dissonance. It may cause a an issue for you. But likewise, if you adopt, say, a spiritual worldview that has a certain ontology behind it, like everything is God, then when you have other kinds of practices that lead to other kinds of experiences where God dissolves, the whole universe disappears, and there's nothingness, now where is your ontology leaving you, right? So I find what people are often doing in spiritual communities is really kind of like pinning themselves into a worldview, into an ontology, into a certain kind of belief system, and then having experiences that are kind of all over the place and not being able to really square those two. And so the model is essentially kind of doing away with the need for the ontology or the worldview to be so limited. It kind of just opens it up and says, well, let's just create a model based on the widest range possible of phenomena that people can experience. Never mind if it's the brain or if it's God or if it's ultimately this, that, or the other. Let's just model the phenomena, model the phenomenology, and then see where that gets us. If we don't start from a kind of a particular worldview, a particular tradition, a particular idea about what's real and what's not, or what's best, or what enlightenment means, or what ultimately the universe looks like. Let's just create a model that's just based on the phenomena themselves, the wide range of phenomena that people can experience, and start with that, and then move forward. That's kind of I guess the vantage point that the model is coming from.
Yeah, beautiful. And my own experience with the model was one of validation, whereas before I was tending innocently to reject aspects of my own experience as just another illusory aspect of phenomena. Suddenly it was like, oh yeah, when I was at a retreat walking and the entire universe blinked out of existence and was replaced with pure, unadulterated compassion for which I had no words and there was no me, I had nothing for that. That was either I'm going crazy or it's an artifact of meditation. And instead now it fits particularly in a particular thread and actually has some overlap. And it allowed then a kind of an acceptance, a kind of a natural radical acceptance of my own experience without any having to make meaning or having to put a worldview around it. Like you said, it's almost like, okay, the experience itself is its own meaning, and it in this model, it sits on a particular thread of development that actually seems to make some sense in the unfolding of the whole thing. And so it's extremely validating, and it's less likely that I'm going to panic or be overcome with fear or doubt, although that could arise too, and that can be part of it. So it's very, very helpful. And so maybe it's a good time to start talking about a little bit about the framework of the model so people can understand. And by the way, you can read about it in depth right now at multidharma.net. I'll put a link in, but that may be a bit much. If you're reasonably adept at this stuff, it's a very good read. It's a very good read no matter what. But maybe we'll go back and sort of outline a little bit so people can see what this model is about. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And just on that point, the multidharma.net has this model written up in about 50 pages. It's a PDF that is kind of the kernel of a new book that I'm writing, and it will eventually be a full-length book. But there's also a more introductory book, which is it's called A Lamp Unto Yourself, and it's actually a guidebook introducing Asian spiritual practices, mostly from Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism. And that book, I wrote it before I came up with the threads metaphor, so it doesn't mention threads, but it essentially has this same ethos that we're talking about now, has the same approach that we're talking about now. It even has 3 out of 4 of the threads that we're going to be talking about in a moment. It just doesn't call them threads. And that is intended to be a beginner book for people who have basically, very little to no experience in spirituality, or else you might have experience in one corner of spirituality, but you want to sort of get introduced to the larger picture. So there's
Perfect.
Sort of like an entry level book, and then there's this more kind of heavyweight theoretical kind of thing that we're going to be talking about.
So all layers of complexity from the very entry beginner to going crazy deep, like I enjoy doing. It's funny,
but
just
not a lot in the middle. I'm not like a spiritual coach or a spiritual guide
no.
who really helps people through, their own personal process. I'm more just sort of like the map maker, the cartographer that lays out the map. And so I have this sort of like, here's how to get started in spirituality with this new map in your mind. And then I have the other, like, here's the more advanced version of the map for people who are deep into it. But I don't sort of, do a lot of support for people who are kind of trying to navigate the map. I'm the cartographer, not the guide that walks people through the territory, right?
Bro, this is why I love you, man, because that's exactly what that showed up exactly when I needed it, because the last thing I need is someone else one-on-oneing me with anything. It's more at this point, this is just where I am, but everybody is in a different place. There's all these resources online. One of the things I will say that this map can be very helpful is cutting through some of the noise. When you see 13 different non-duality speakers or Vedantic Hinduism or Advaita on YouTube, and everybody's got their approach and they're all arguing a little bit with each other. Oh, no, it's this. And oh, that's not. Oh, no, Tony Parsons says this, but then so-and-so says that. You can actually see in every single one of them a particular flavor of thread that's unfolding and recognize it. And that's beautiful.
They're all dug into a particular spot on one or another thread and speaking from that spot.
That's exactly right. That's clear. Exactly. Yeah. It becomes obvious. It almost becomes funny because you go, I don't even think they can see that because they're so deep in that one thread. And certainly a lot of their particular audience doesn't necessarily see it. So if they have an experience that's outside of that framework, it can be disconcerting or dismissed. And it's tough now because there becomes a point where it's very hard to dismiss any experience because it's experience. It's what's showing up. And even then even experience starts to stop. And you can't even say there's experience, but that's a different thread. So anyway, so back to the threads model. How do you want to sort of lay this out as an introduction?
Yeah, I think, with the caveat that we are just talking about a model, and this is not any claims about what reality is like or anything like that. I think it would be maybe helpful just to separate out two different kinds of spiritual experiences or categories of spiritual experiences, categories of practice, traditions, worldviews, kind of ideas, to separate those two out, just to start us off by taking kind of like the whole cluster of spirituality or the whole, universe of spirituality and splitting it into two threads, just to sort of like start the separation process. And then we'll separate out a couple other things and make 4 threads. But before I do that, what I want to give is just a brief definition of how I use the term awakening, because I know that itself is something that all sorts of different definitions exist and people argue over that. So
no one awakens, bro. There is no awakening, bro.
Right.
Without awakening, you're nothing, bro. Yeah. A lot of bros involved. Yeah.
Yes. And that's maybe something we can talk about too, is, different, I think there are different threads that are more resonant with different genders, with different cultures, with different, social, people in different social roles. And that's maybe something that we can talk about later once the threads are on the table. But yeah, so my definition of awakening is just a practical definition for purposes of having a conversation. I would say for me, I would use that term to refer to a moment that comes. It can come suddenly and dramatically. It can also sort of emerge slowly. It can also kind of appear and then disappear and appear and then disappear. So it could unfold in a number of ways. But there's essentially a process where an individual who previously has completely identified with the so-called narrative self, I am Pierce, I'm a father, a professor, a brother, a son, I live in this material world. I have my job and my values and my money and sort of my whole kind of identity structure built up. And you go from having your identity entirely fused into that narrative self, to an awakening would be to have the identity extract or pop out of that narrative self and land somewhere else. I'm saying it in a weird way, because where that identity lands is the beginning of the threads. So for some people, when they have this awakening experience, their identity is going to land in I am. There is no self, right? Let's start with that one. So their identity is going to land. Oh, I thought that I was this self, and now I see that was an illusion. I see that that's a construct. I see that was just a mental fabrication that I was operating with. So we could say this type of awakening experience is the beginning of a thread that I call the emptiness thread. I sometimes I gave these multiple names, and I kind of use them sometimes interchangeably. So the emptiness thread, also deconstruction thread, deconstruction, as in you're deconstructing concepts, you're deconstructing reality, you're seeing through concepts and constructs. So your identity could land there, and then this would begin the emptiness thread process of seeing through more and more concepts, seeing through more and more aspects that you previously held to be true, and you're seeing they are also constructs, they're also just concepts, and they fall away. Alternatively, your awakening could land your new identity in what I call the oneness thread. So the oneness thread would be, I previously thought I was little Pierce in the world, doing all that stuff. And now suddenly I realize, oh, I am God. I am the universe. I am something much bigger and more inclusive, right? So one is the emptying out of the identity. I'm nothing. There's no self. I can see through that. The other is this kind of like additive self, like suddenly I am everything, right? So I'm nothing or I'm everything. And these two experiences, I call both of them awakenings, because they're both an awakening up out of the narrative self into a new kind of meta level perspective. And they open a thread, which would be the thread of emptiness or the thread of oneness. Should I stop there? Do you have
Pierce, like, I just love this shit so much. Like, because so as you're talking about this is experientially my experience with awakening as well. And so the narrative self, by the way, when you were describing the narrative self, as I'll go, I'm Pierce and I'm in this world and I have this money and I have these stories. And I started having, it's interesting, I could feel a response in the body, which was this almost like a PTSD type feeling of, yeah, that's what it's like being a person. Like it is that way. And when you don't know anything else, it's in some sense tolerable. But at some point that snap, that awakening happens. And so for me in 2012, it happened spontaneously. I left the Bay Area at Stanford where I had a job, and I quit and I moved to Las Vegas with my family. And that was so destabilizing with a series of things that happened. Suddenly one evening, it was just like pop. Oh my God, I was never this. Like I am. And so for me, where it landed was, and this is just to kind of put it in context in my own experience, it landed as presence, which I later started calling consciousness. So it's like, oh, I was never Zubin in space and time. I was always presence, which is all there is. And so then there's this, with that, I think you might mention or have mentioned in the past, there can be this huge sense of energetic release or bliss or happiness or relief if the previous state was so kind of contracted. And so with it can come a lot of sense of relief, and you might feel like instantly like you're fully enlightened, like there's nothing else to know, like everything is perfect. Oh my God, I am presence. And you're right, some people will pop out into there's nothing happened, there's no self at all, and some will pop into that oneness, divinity, love thread where it's like, oh, I am God. And I used to think, oh, these are all just different words for the same thing. But now it's clear, no, they're experientially actually felt differently. Yeah.
Yeah, very different. Although people will use words like consciousness and awareness and so forth for both, so it can be a little bit confusing which thread you're talking about if you're just using these neutral words like awareness and consciousness. So if somebody has the experience that you had and they're saying, "Oh, I am presence," if that is I am presence, meaning that the self construct has collapsed and it's been hollowed out, right? And you're just left with presence. That's more of an emptiness thread version of that. If you're left with presence and you're thinking something like, and presence is the entire universe, everything is presence, everything is awareness, everything is consciousness, right? Or something like that, then that's more of a oneness version of that sort of word, right? So the words that people use to describe this, I'm more interested in kind of the description of the phenomenology that I am in the particular word the label that they put on it when I distinguish between the threads.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other thing that you just said was the quality of the experience. For me, a true awakening experience is going to have this quality of, first of all, a quality of just amazement, or it can be overwhelming. Some people have like an overwhelming kind of, I'm overwhelmed, and it's kind of a little bit more negative, but just a strong effective visceral response to this kind of shift is quite normal. And often, you're right, often it really does seem like I'm enlightened now. Like I've seen the ultimate truth. I've seen it all the way to the end. And there's often an ontological shift that people make at this point, right? I previously was an atheist, but now I see I am God, or I am, consciousness or whatever. And now I've completely changed my ontology, because now I see the truth. And the truth really is that the whole universe is nothing but consciousness, right? So there's like an ontology or a worldview that's created out of this experience as well.
Yes.
So it's a shift in identity, a shift in ontology, a shift in kind of like how you're, a shift in meaningfulness of the universe, right? Like the meaning of existence is now totally changed for you. There's a number of shifts that take place kind of together in this kind of momentous awakening experience.
Yeah,
and we should say that's also a lot of people experience this much more gradually. And so it's just kind of like people who do a lot of Buddhist meditation, for example, might spend decades kind of like very slowly thinning it out. Yeah. They may not have this kind of large experience.
That's right. So that's the other thing we want to say is, like, again, in this map or this conception of this, there's no wrong. So it might be that you have this very slow fading away, or it might be that it's like a pop and then a fade, or it might be that it's a series of anything is possible for any individual.
Anything is possible.
Yeah.
And because there aren't discrete stages here, we're not talking stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. We're just talking about sort of an opening of a thread and then a gradual sort of deepening into the thread. That really can happen at any speed, in whatever way. You can hop down to the end really quick. You can slowly move down, but you can also bounce back and forth. And this happens to a lot of people, where you have sort of like an awakening experience. Oh, I am God. Oh wait, now I'm just Pierce again. Oh wait, now I'm God again. Now I'm Pierce again. Right? And there's sort of a kind of a bouncing back and forth, on the thread. So yeah, and all of this is the skillful teachings for opening the threads and moving down the threads. I think we have those in many teachers, in many traditions. There's lots of different ways of opening these threads. And it's just a recognition that traditions tend to specialize in threads, in particular threads. And so if I'm really looking to open up the emptiness thread, I'm really looking to have the experience of non-self, I'm probably going to start with most forms of Buddhism that really highlight that as their central doctrine, and the practices are really oriented around having that kind of experience. On the other hand, if I'm looking for like oneness type experiences, Christian mysticism, there's Hindu devotionalism, there's different kinds of systems that really prioritize that. The modern kind of neo-Advaita that's kind of comes out of Ramana Maharshi and all of that is, I think, could go in either direction, because some of those teachers, I hear them talking about emptying out the self, and then other people, I hear them talking about I am awareness, right? So there's a little bit of, it could go either way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's that devotional aspect too that comes from their traditions. Like Nisargadatta would, have devotional aspects to his guru every night, but the way he speaks is in that sort of emptiness. With it can get subtle.
Yeah. Let's come back to Nisargadatta, because I think he's doing what I call braiding, which
that makes sense.
Which we can talk
that
about.
May make sense as to why I find him so interesting, because there's a lot going on. It's not just this.
It's not just one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So we were talking about the emptiness, the de-reification, the deconstruction thread as one of the main threads.
Yeah.
And then, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So each one of these threads is it's a whole trajectory. It's a whole developmental trajectory. And although it feels like you've seen the ultimate truth and you're enlightened, when you have that initial awakening, I think everybody eventually realizes that there's more work to be done.
Whoops. Shit.
Whoops.
Yeah.
And so you start the journey of deepening down the thread. And so in each thread, if it's a thread, it has a trajectory towards more and more and more of reality being hollowed out, being emptied out, seeing through the concepts, seeing through the structures, and first these are gross mental constructs, big, sort of ideas and so forth are seen through. As you get further and further down the thread, perception starts to break apart and dissolve. You previously were seeing things as solid objects. Now it's kind of like, pixelated or blocky kind of visual or auditory or sensory kind of, the senses are sort of seeming to dissolve. Getting down to really fundamental constructs like time and space, boundary between inside and outside and so forth, collapsing, and eventually towards the deepest end of this thread, it's the complete kind of hollowing out of all experience. So all experience starts sort of like fading or becoming like wispy, kind of mirage like. The experience, we can get into more detail about some of these threads, maybe later, but just in general, I want to say one of the key things that happens on this thread is the both the subject, meaning like a viewer, as well as the objects, meaning like all the phenomena that are being viewed, both of those sides of the subject-object duality dissolving. So we're not just talking about a stable witness that's viewing all of the objects becoming, less and less reified, but the subject itself is also less and less reified, and so you have like the whole of reality seems to be collapsing around you, and then ultimately it culminates in when all of reality does collapse, both subject and object collapses. You're left with this kind of blank out or blink out, what in different traditions is referred to. It could be nirvikalpa samadhi, it could be nirodha, or what people call cessation, just kind of like a blacking out of all of reality, and that is the end of the emptiness thread. Meanwhile, if you're working on the oneness thread, it's moving down towards every last thing in the universe, every last phenomena being one, being united, being unified, being seen as part of the whole. And so here, a lot of times the oneness thread opens up with a lot of emotional kind of qualities. Like for me, the oneness thread opened up with through metta bhavana meditation in a Buddhist context, which is about sending loving kindness to others, and sort of like a heartfelt sort of connection or intimacy or feeling of well-being for others. And there it's like me here with the others over there. And there's kind of like an intimacy or transmission of love between us. But then that sort of like separation, as you move further down the thread, that separation starts to dissolve. So, it can be, I am love, or I am God, or everything is one. And the subject that was previously sort of sitting outside of that, witnessing the love, or witnessing, there's me here and there's God there. I'm one with God. There's still the I, right? I'm one with God. That I eventually, as you move further down the thread, gets absorbed into God. In the end, there's just one. There's just one thing. There's just a unity. Anything that I used to think of as me is part of this unity. There is no separation anywhere, and that would be the end of the oneness thread. I'm going through these a little bit quickly, but I think people will kind of get.
They'll vibe. They'll vibe on it. And the thing about the oneness thread is that maybe bears mentioning is that it's a visceral, almost kinesthetic thing. It's not a conceptual knowing that everything is one. It is, as that thread unravels towards its end, it's a real physical felt sense of there's just love, or there's just God. And you're right. The subject that would become one with God dissolves into just this godness. And it's all kinds of different ways. And I used to think that I didn't get any much of that thread. And not only am I realizing, oh no, actually, yes, like pure, like energetic love coming from the chest and connecting to every particle in the universe is what it feels like. And you can, because it doesn't fit into the emptiness narrative so well, I used to try to reject it and go, this is just another movement of mind. And one thing I think that bears with this, so we've talked about two threads, this emptiness thread and the oneness thread. Each of the threads goes down to every particle of phenomenal experience. Like it can seem to explain or seem to encompass everything. And so when that thread is showing up, there's nothing else in some sense for many, and they'll talk as if this is everything. This is all you need to know. Yeah, and it kind of rejects everything else.
By definition, if it's not a completely immersive experiential reality that seems completely like it's the ultimate truth, then if it's not that, then I don't think it's actually an awakening. I don't think it's actually a thread, right? It's a completely immersive, undeniable, I have seen the ultimate truth, and it can be nothing other than this. That defines a thread. So the problem is, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say it's kind of funny because friends will call me up and they'll say, "Okay, I just had this. Everything is love. That's it." And the conviction and the felt sense of it is so obvious. You're like, oh yeah, that's the oneness awakening. Yeah.
That's a confirmation that when I hear somebody say that, it's like, yeah, okay, you had the awakening. That's great. Just, try to hold that ontology really lightly, because, if you get locked into that and you really create like a whole worldview around that, and you start, really kind of reinforcing, yes, this is how the universe is, and everybody who disagrees with this, who hasn't seen this, is wrong. You're kind of like, sticking yourself into some quicksand that's going to be hard to get out of later, right?
And
stick yourself in.
That's right. And physically and emotionally painful to get out of. So for me, the everything was consciousness early on, a decade plus ago, that happened, got me down a rabbit hole of like scientific consciousness study and what if everything was just consciousness? And I really invested a worldview in that, like, this makes total sense. Now everything's explicable and my suffering is put in context and so on. And when the emptiness thread started to unravel more for me, and I realized there was actually consciousness was another just radiant appearance of nothing, that ontological framework of like, oh, that fell away, and it was extremely painful. Almost a nihilism sort of arose where it was like, nothing has any meaning.
Yeah.
Like I can't even hold on to this anymore. Yeah.
I built my whole universe and my whole identity out of this thing, and it's not there anymore. So
yes. Yeah.
And so what I wanted to point out was the sort of the definitions of enlightenment that different traditions or different people might be carrying around are dependent on which threads they are valuing. And so I just wanted to sort of point out that in Theravada Buddhism, at least the schools of Theravada Buddhism I'm aware of, they define enlightenment, or define, becoming an arhat, becoming an the peak of their particular tradition is having experienced that cessation at the bottom of the emptiness thread, a certain number of times, and you're now an arhat. Meanwhile, in other traditions, right, it's experiencing the full oneness, dissolving the self into Brahman and just being part of the field as one, and that's the ultimate, achievement of that tradition. Then you have a school like Mahayana Buddhism, which actually sees both, and they advocate, you need both emptiness and compassion, or ultimate compassion. You need both kind of these threads to be equally developed in order to become enlightened in their tradition, right? So each tradition has its own kind of distinct definition of enlightenment, of what the goal is, and then each tradition has its own kind of practices to lead you there, and its own worldviews about how, what's happening and why we're doing this. And so the goal, my point here is not to pick any one tradition and say this is the one that is right and everything else is wrong. My approach is just to sort of like locate these traditions and their different worldviews and their different ideas within a larger kind of matrix, or a larger kind of model that can allow us to see the distinctions between them and understand how they may or may not fit together.
Yeah. Where would you put, say, a Christianity?
Christianity is definitely Christian mysticism for sure is a oneness tradition, right? At least the practices that I'm aware of all involve sort of merging with God, losing yourself in God, blending the individual self into the one. Of course they have very different language than Hinduism when they're talking about that, but the kind of the basic move. I'm not saying the practices are the same. I'm not saying the phenomenology is 100% the same. I'm not saying, I'm not making claims that they're both, arriving at the same truth or whatever. But just phenomenologically, when you listen to the way people are describing the experiences they're having, they're both headed in the direction of dissolving the separate self into a larger whole, as opposed to hollowing out. Right? That you would see with the emptiness.
Makes sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've kind of elucidated a little bit the emptiness thread, that oneness thread. Yeah. But as you alluded earlier, there are maybe a lot of threads, but there's two more sort of bigger threads.
Yeah, there's two more principal spiritual threads that a lot of spiritual traditions are working with. And so the third thread is what I just call it the energy thread. And I want to say something that's true about all of the threads is particularly in the case of the energy thread, the energy thread, I'm not talking about energy work like acupuncture and Reiki and things like that. People can work with energy their whole lives and not have it be a path of awakening, right? So I'm talking about awakening, systems or traditions that center the whole practice of spirituality around an energetic awakening. And so here I'm thinking of things like Kundalini in the Hindu yoga system. There's also a parallel tradition in Tantric Buddhism, and Taoism is a huge set of practices and ideas around sort of the role of energy and awakening. There's probably others that people are familiar with that I'm less so, but those are kind of like traditions that are really working with the body and really, they may have components of, deconstruction meditations or meditations or visualizations on oneness, to some extent, but in these traditions, the the fundamental impetus, or the fundamental kind of like spark that leads to awakening, is the awakening of the energy system of the body. And the energy system kind of lights up or opens up in whatever way they describe it. And this leads to the opening of a thread, right? So I previously thought that I was little Pierce with my whole life and so forth. And now what I see is just everything is this like field of energy, or everything is just, all of reality and myself too is just, a whole, dynamic kind of dance of, the cosmic energy. It could be, they might articulate this as being, a goddess is, giving birth to the universe every moment, or it could just be like, the chi is or the Tao is like, the flow of kind of nature and the flow of things, and I fit into that. But again, here, as you move further and further down this thread, more and more and more of your experience and phenomena are revealed to be energetic, or revealed to be, non-static, dynamic kind of energy. And then down at the bottom of the thread, it's like, there's no longer the viewer who's the consciousness or the awareness that sees the dance of energy, but actually the viewer, the one who is seeing that is also kind of
the dance.
The dance. And so the whole thing becomes like one field where everything's just, sparkly, bubbly, champagne bubble kind of like, field of potentiality, potential energy, nothing solid, nothing actually ever comes into existence, because it's all just so fluid and so ephemeral.
So, and I have to say, like, the energy thread, when I first read about it in your thing, I was like, oh, that's what that is. Because these things had been happening to me, and I couldn't, they had no context in these other traditions that I could find, because I was very much in this emptiness mindset, so to speak. And I remember sitting in meditation and just having everything pixelate, turn into like that scene at the end of The Matrix where he's looking at the Matrix and everything is just the numbers. But I was that too, and there wasn't an I, and it was just that, and it was so ephemeral you couldn't even say it was happening, and yet it was all that was there. And it was so disconcerting. I remember thinking, number one, oh, whatever that is, I want that back, because it must be some like something pointing at some truth. But the second thing was like, this doesn't fit anywhere in my ontologies about what awakening is, because it just didn't make sense. And then it came later with a lot of kundalini, a lot of energetics, then spontaneous practices like yoga started showing up, but I had no container for it. And I just thought, oh, this is a side thing. Yeah.
So this is why you like this model, because you're the perfect candidate for the model.
Yeah.
Because
self-selecting.
And I'm like this too. I had so many different, I have a background in comparative Asian religions. I've been studying this stuff for years. And so I have read all of these different things and practiced all these different things. And then you start having experiences that are coming out of different traditions and sort of not, necessarily fitting into one another. So my model came from that kind of experience, but you're describing that, I was in this meditation retreat, ostensibly focused on this path, and suddenly this other thread opens up, or I'm just doing my thing and I'm used to one kind of thread, and suddenly this third thread opens up, right? And I don't have context for it. I don't know how to make sense of it. And you can, one of the things that I'm hoping my work points people to is the value of navigating different traditions as necessary in order to get the support you need from different threads. So if I'm sitting in the Vipassana retreat and suddenly start having a Kundalini awakening, and I go to the Vipassana teacher, they're going to tell me that's just a concept. Yeah. It's just, you're just getting, wrapped up in the, in the
fabrications
of the mind, fabrications, just see through them, it's anicca, not the, just see through it. It's non-self. It's so they're giving you really good advice for emptiness thread. Yeah. But, and maybe you do that, and maybe your Kundalini awakening just kind of like falls by the wayside and doesn't really develop into a thread. But if you leave that retreat and now you're having Kundalini symptoms, and it's really kind of like an ongoing issue or an ongoing phenomena for you, and you're starting to struggle with, Kundalini, or it's suggesting some things to you that seem to be interesting, and you want to kind of like lean into it a little bit, work with it a little bit, your Vipassana teacher is not the person who's going to help you with that. And so the model would suggest, oh, I'm having energetic type awakening phenomena, I could go in the direction of, let's say, Taoism, and start, talking with a Qigong master, and start, working with, visualizations of energies and so forth. Or I might go into like a tantric, more Hindu or Buddhist kind of energetic practice context and get some advice there. And it doesn't mean that the Vipassana teacher is wrong. It doesn't mean that Vipassana is wrong. It doesn't mean that you can't still do Vipassana and still get a lot of benefit from that teacher. It's just now you need more than one practice system in order to accommodate the kinds of things that you're experiencing.
Yeah, and that's the key thing. And I think a lot of people like come out of a particular type of retreat having those other threads having opened, and they, again, they're either lost, or they might even try to shut it down or reject it. Whereas it might be that there's a lot of fruit that ultimately can be born in each of these threads using different traditions. So for what happened with us is my wife and I both started having a lot of energetic stuff after a shift that happened a couple of years ago. And we both being physicians and kind of scientists were like, what the hell is this? Maybe this is all just placebo, like some epiphenomenon of awakening. But then she got a book on chakras, and we started reading about it. And we're like, hey, wait a minute. That actually has some relevance to the phenomenal experience. Like, forget about causation and all that. Just the experience of it correlates to these different energy centers, and you can actually feel this energy moving. And then we were able to sort of do some interesting things that would not have unraveled had we closed off to that, or just believed it all to be another, empty appearance, which that's all fine. That's part of the emptiness thread. But it was helpful to go allow that thread to show up the way that it did.
Yeah. And one of the points that I make in the beginning book, The Lamp Unto Yourself, this beginner book for people just getting started in spirituality, one of the points I make there is, I see these threads as being kind of like natural, like people are naturally inclined towards one or the other, or like a certain set of them, and that has, I don't know why. Does it have to do with karma, biology, like whatever ontology you want to you have? You might explain this differently, but it just turns out, I think, that people have a certain inclination, and you don't necessarily know what your inclination is until you start having awakening experiences. So you might, for example, actually my own example, I spent 5 years in really intensive Theravada Buddhist meditation retreats, kind of getting nowhere, beating my head.
I know that feeling.
The emptiness thread.
Yeah.
And I went for I did a Metta Bhavana retreat, and within a couple of weeks I was having these like massive sort of like, heart opening experiences, flooding with love and all the bells and whistles, after just a couple of weeks of doing that kind of practice. And so it turns out that I was more inclined towards oneness thread type activities than towards emptiness thread type activities. Now, the emptiness thread opened up later for me. It did open up, but what initially had to happen was the oneness thread for me. So you don't really know what practices are going to be most effective for you. You don't know which threads are going to be more. You don't know which threads you're going to have more talent or more skill or more ability in than the others. And so I think it's probably good advice to start a spiritual practice with a wide range of repertoire, and try different things and sort of like see where there is some benefit and where you're getting some kind of response from the practices, and not be totally wedded to one ideology or one tradition, from the beginning, and say like, no matter what, I'm going to stay in this tradition, but really to be flexible, like you were saying, you were suggesting you and your wife were. So yeah, I started out in this practice, and then I started having these other phenomena happen. So then I took on that practice too, and I started working with that. And it may just be that that you are a multi-threaded person that has multiple threads open that you want to work with simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thread for me is the asshole thread, which I think is central. That one's still on. It's still unraveling to its ultimate anus. Yeah, no. Like, joking aside, like, I think again, that's the beauty of this approach is it's an open one. It says, okay, yeah, what shows up for you is going to be unique based on we don't know what. Like you said, there's no ontologic explanation for why people wake up in different ways, and even the falling away of practices, even the falling away of spirituality, can be encompassed ultimately in this sort of view, because that can show up too, that all of it just deconstructs, which is probably a discussion for a later time.
We'll talk about that at the end.
Sure. For sure. So we have the deconstruction, de-reification, emptiness thread. We have the oneness, unity, love, God thread, divinity thread, and then we have the energy, everything dynamic thread. Is there another thread here?
Yeah. Number 4.
This is a good one. This one kind of blew my mind because, it showed up in funky ways. Yeah.
So this is the one I always leave it for 4th because it's the one that that takes a little bit more kind of explaining to get the way that I'm talking about it. If you understand the other threads, what makes it a thread is the trajectory towards the end point, right? You awaken into a particular different kind of meta level identity, and then there's a trajectory towards all of the universe kind of being seen through that particular framework. The psyche thread is the same. So I've gone back and forth with different names for this: psyche thread, unconscious thread. This original awakening experience will be an awakening into something like some portion of who I am, some portion of my being that I previously was completely blind to, has now appeared and shown me that what I previously thought was something that I was doing now is seen to be actually something that is being done by this larger whole, by this larger sense of being than I had before. I'm saying that in a really generic way because people have all kinds of different ways that they talk about this, and all sorts of different language and all sorts of different experiences that come through this thread. This thread is the psyche thread. It is we are talking about things that have been understood through various forms of Western psychology. But like in the case of, energy thread, when I said there's energy work and then there's awakenings that involve the energy thread. So there are, therapeutic systems that are for healing, that are for, dealing with and managing, aspects of daily life and so forth. That's one thing. This is an awakening that's oriented towards, these kinds of phenomena. So there are some forms of psychology, Western psychology, that I think are oriented towards awakening. And Jungian psychology is the one that I think most people are familiar with, right? An awakening from the narrative self into, there is the collective unconscious, and so much of my so much of my life is actually being dictated by this collective unconscious, or by the shadow, and so much of what I've thought of as myself is actually being dictated by the shadow, right? And so an expansive view of the self, where the narrative self now becomes part of this larger picture that was previously unconscious or unseen. That would be the way this would look within a psychology framework. But there's all kinds of other frameworks that would make the same move, sort of structurally the same, but the content's a little bit different. So other traditions will say something like, let's say, Indian traditions might say, so much of what I thought I was doing is actually just karma. It's actually just my previous kind of imprints of previous lives on my current behavior. And so if you have an awakening experience that is where you are suddenly seeing that everything you're doing is coming from karma as opposed to your own kind of agency or your own egoic kind of will, then you could say that's this type of awakening. Indigenous traditions will often talk about ancestors in the same kind of way. I am not me. I am actually this whole lineage of ancestors that's acting through me, right? So that kind of an awakening. I am, I thought I was just me, but actually I thought I was just, pure one entity, but I'm actually a conglomeration of all these different spirit beings that have all sort of, come together to form who I am. Let's say that could be another indigenous traditional kind of way of expressing things. This thread is variable because of all the different cultural expressions and all the different ways that people have talked about the unconscious material, but essentially what we're talking about here is a deepening into more and more and more of the parts of the psyche or the unconscious mind, more and more deeper and deeper into all of the ways that how I act and what I think and who I think I am is actually beyond my control, is actually being conditioned by deeper and deeper layers. So personal trauma, personal biographical material, intergenerational, genetic inheritance, going further, social, cultural constructions of the way that I am, how I behave, how I think I have opinions that I've come to myself, but they're actually coming from my social context, my cultural context. They're coming from the fact that I'm male, from the fact that I'm straight, from the fact that I'm Latino, from the fact that I'm, was born outside of the US, from the fact that I speak English and Spanish, from all of these different layers. How much of who I think I am and how I see the world is actually just conditioned by the fact that I'm a mammal, right? And so I have a certain kind of way of responding to stimulus that a reptile doesn't have. How much of, the fact that, I behave in certain ways, how much of that is actually my hormones or my gut microbiome or my, my physical body or chemicals. And at the far end of the thread, so whether you're seeing yourself as being a material body made out of chemicals, like I was just saying, or you're seeing yourself as being, create, all sorts of spirits, or you're seeing yourself as being a soul that has all these previous lives in the astral plane, and now you're on this earth to do a particular mission, right? No matter what version of the psyche thread you're working your way through, the bottom of the thread is the realization that every single last speck of reality and perception, every single last little particle in the universe, every last little bit of experience is completely conditioned, completely beyond any of my own doership or control or ability. Everything's just a projection coming from my own psyche. That's the psyche thing.
It really is one of my favorites, because hearing it described is you're always just eating popcorn. Like, how do you even begin to scratch this? Because you're talking about every cause and condition from the Big Bang until now, including, like you said, I'm a mammal, I'm a male, I'm Latino, all the things that go into it. But the end point of the thread is the part that is the punchline in every single thread, which is everything you thought that reality was is that. No, it's like this. It is, and in a sense, actually, the end of the emptiness thread and the end of the unconscious thread are saying the same thing. There never was a doer there doing anything. It's all this orchestration of nothing. Energy thread, same thing. They're all saying that. The divinity thread, right? Same thing.
Yeah,
same thing.
Divinity thread. This is all God. This is all sort of like a plan. This is all the universe just universing. This is all the life just lifing. Right. That's the oneness thread version of this.
Yes.
So they all end in some form of non-duality, right, where the subject and the object has collapsed into one, and they all end with the the non with the disappearance of the self, whether it's the hollowing out or the melting into or the dissolution or the self was all just a
puppet dancing, projection, cause and conditions.
They all end with the same kind of takeaway point, right? They all end with that, and for me, that's one of the reasons why I don't think it ultimately makes too much sense to argue between the threads which one is the best way. I mean, they all will wind up with, I don't want to say they wind up in the same place because the phenomenology is really different, but the implications are the same in all cases, where it's the overcoming of this divide between the self and everything else is somehow blown away, or that distinction is somehow annihilated. Yeah.
Some collapse of delusion seems to occur at the end of each thread, if you can speak in that way, although even that's I'm a little uncomfortable with that. I don't know why.
It smells a little bit like an ontology, like there's
it does.
This is a better way of viewing reality than just sort of the ordinary.
That's right. That's right. Because there is, and this may be another discussion for another time, but there is this, as these threads kind of, and we can talk about, braiding and integrating of the threads, because I think a lot of people are probably going, oh, I had this thread and then it kind of seemed to intertwine with this thread, or it alternated with this. And so that's a big piece of this. And then the integration of that into maybe the fifth thread, which is gross reality, like going to pick up your kids from school. And then ultimately the release of all the threads and that's another discussion. But so we have the four main threads: emptiness, unity, divinity, oneness, energy, and that psyche unconscious. By the way, let just a couple more things on the psyche unconscious, because I know people are wondering. So how the hell, so for me, that thread showed up unbidden, as memories from past, almost inner, they almost materialized as an inner child that was actually trying to get my attention and was showing me how they saw the world. And then a memory attached to, oh, that happened because of this conditioning that occurred. And I behave in these unconscious ways because this child kind of seemingly takes identity and starts pulling the wheel. And boy, I do some shitty things that weren't explicable, but now they seem to make sense. So just seeing that conditioning is there, that it's showing itself, that it arises, and that it's made conscious in a way, like, oh, that's been there, is how it kind of started to show up for me. Yeah. And then talking about it, processing it with another, like whether it's my wife or an internal family system therapist, was interesting, that just held space for that. But I'm curious, like what more you can say about this thing.
I mean, you described it really well. The words you put around that came out of kind of an IFS framework, right? Inner child, taking the identity, and so forth. I mean, somebody coming from a radically different framework might talk about this, being, there's a certain kind of animal spirit that lives in my back, and it kind of like comes out and causes me to act in certain ways at certain times, right? And I need to understand that this animal spirit, it lives in my body, and I need to sort of relate to it in a certain way. I mean, that would be kind of a very different framework, but kind of arriving at the same conclusion. So that's why I say, like, whether we're talking about shamanism, or we're talking about psychotherapy, or we're talking about, astral plane kind of like, work that people do, past lives work, etc. I think, the way that people talk about it can be quite different, but the essential thing is to, I think, with the psyche material, this is actually something I should have said clearly from the beginning. I think a lot of traditions treat the psyche thread as like a sideshow.
Yes.
That's stuff that that's just like old karma we need to clear out. Yeah. To get back to the awakening, right? Or it's like, this is now like a cloudy sort of period where this stuff is going to come up to be processed, and then it's going to be released, and then I can get back to, my enlightenment. And I have a very different viewpoint about
me too.
the psyche as a thread, for me, it's as equally valuable as an awakening path as any of the other threads. And the key to this thread is to allowing, or to welcome more and more wisdom, more and more awareness, more and more consciousness about how deeply constructed, deeply conditioned this being that I thought I was in charge of. I thought Pierce was the actor here and the doer here. And so, previously all of these other things, I would shove them down. I would deny them. I would ignore them. They were in the unconscious. They were in the shadow, because I thought I was in charge and I felt that they were threatening. Right. So it's about, like, the practice with this thread. It's about learning to accept and welcome, invite forward all of these ways that I'm conditioned. And instead of feeling, I mean, they still could be a little bit threatening, but instead of really, like, living in the denial, is really just exploring, what, in what ways do these things, whether it's spirits or hormones or inner child, right? In what way do these things actually dictate, who I think I am, and how do they actually steer this being when I think I'm making decisions? And to really understand that and to welcome that. In the process, I think there are many parts of the psyche that are going to be healed. So the inner child coming forward, who's been told to sit in the shadow and be quiet for the last 40 years, now is coming forward and is being welcomed forward and can speak. That inner child can speak his truth, and he can say, actually, did you notice that occasionally I grab control and I, act out in certain ways because I haven't been heard and I haven't been able to express myself, and by allowing the space for that inner child to be able to express himself, now he becomes a healed part of the whole. And now this sort of like deep trauma or something that was really, bothering you and was problematic may be healed. Great. But a huge portion of the psyche is not going to be healed. Like, we're not going to heal you from being
a mammal,
right?
Yeah,
a mammal.
Right.
We're not going to heal you from your ethnicity. We're not going to heal you from your, your the fact of where you were born and what language you speak. Right. These are just these are conditionings that are, just completely baked into the system, right? And they're going to always be there. And so it's a matter of kind of not healing in the sense of getting rid of them, but it's more about just really reconciling yourself to these facts and understanding them and having them not be threatening to you, right? Just understanding, this particular being is constructed in this particular way and kind of like acts and says things in certain ways. And that has to do with all of these other factors, right, that are beyond my control. And I'm not threatened by that. It's just, that's just the way that this being is, right? So now there's the other possibility, like you were saying, the asshole thread making a joke earlier, there's the possibility that what I'm saying about the psyche thread could also make you think like, oh, I'm just free license to be an asshole because I'm just constructed that way, right? So there's a constant sort of very subtle balancing act here with working with the psyche thread between sort of denial and bypassing, right? That you need to constantly be sort of like very honest with yourself and very, very, very tender and very. It's difficult. It's difficult work. It's painful work. It's challenging work, and you have to be very sort of, I think, patient, honest, authentic with yourself as you're kind of like navigating this material.
Okay, yeah. So that was beautifully said. I think for some reason this thread is for me also very paramount, and it's surprisingly so to the whole awakening construct, if that's what it is. First of all, there's a radical aspect here of acceptance, of welcoming, of saying, yeah, this is actually how it is, and letting go of this idea that you can push and pull on it consciously in this way. And yet there's something that you just pointed out, which is by seeing and allowing all this, like, yeah, okay, there's an underlying asshole thread in Zubin that likes to be a jerk and push people's buttons. And where did that come from? And when you really dig in, you see this little kid here who was bullied and, needed to keep safe and had to create control and so on. And so there's a kind of a radical compassion that naturally arises that's maybe pulled from the love divinity thread that braids into it. And it's just like, oh. And then there's this reconditioning, almost a new conditioning that appears that says, okay, so I don't have to necessarily be an asshole to be safe. And that it doesn't necessarily heal, it's accepted. But then the next thing that you do is not necessarily have that part hijack, but rather see it clearly. And there's a new aspect that, like you said, is very subtle. It's very tender. You have to be very, I don't like this word, but you have to be very present with it to really allow it to integrate. And then you may find you're less of a dick.
The example you gave, I think, I'm not your therapist, so I don't know all the details, but I think it's a good example of an aspect that could partially be healed and then partially not healed. So the healing part is, you understand, I treat other people like this because I was bullied when I was a child, and there's this whole sort of pattern that's been put into place that now I understand and I can accept, and now I see that this has really dictated my life and my behavior in ways that are beyond my control, and I'm kind of reconciling with that. And let's say it heals to an extent that you're not as much of a dick as you were before, but we're not talking about healing the fact that you're kind of like a provocateur, and that's built into your personality. You're a little sassy, you're a little kind of in your face. You've got this sort of social dynamic that's just part of who you are. So you don't have to be an asshole, but you're not going to just suddenly become a monastic that's all very calm and super neutral all the time, because that's not who you are. And so it's about both healing the wound, but then also celebrating the gift, right? And I think usually the wound and the gift are the same thing. Just two sides of the same coin, right? So once you heal the wounded inner child that's turning this personality trait into a burden, once that's healed, now the personality trait is liberated to just be itself, and you could just be yourself, and you're being the clown or whatever in the social environment, and it's just there I am, there I go again. It's just Zubin being Zubin. That's who I am, right? So I can't apologize for that. That's just part of my personality. But when my inner child hijacks that part of my personality and turns me into an asshole, then that's the wound.
Perfectly said. Yeah, that's how it's experienced, is when this thread starts to unravel, Zubin can Zubin in an authentic way. That is the sum total of all the conditioning. And yet there's a clarity, what can heal will heal, and what integrates in a way into the whole does. And then there's a radical acceptance of Zubin as Zubin. So he is that way. And this is, I think, that this thread is often minimized in many spiritual circles, I think, is to a great detriment, because what happens is people assume these spiritual personas, I'm the good person who's spiritually awake, and I'm not going to let these aspects of my personality out because they're not consistent with, the Rupert Spira who sits in perfect equanimity, or whatever, pick your guru of choice. And I think that it creates such a dissonance when the conditioning arises, because the conditioning's not going anywhere, and you can't, so this thread is near and dear to me.
Yeah, me too. And for me, I had a 4-thread awakening process, so all 4 of these are very sort of real for me. But I think this is really simple. I think what most people are doing is taking the idealized version of the hero of one of the threads and just assuming that is the end all be all of enlightenment, right? So the mythological hero at the end of the emptiness thread is the Buddha, or the cave dwelling Tibetan,
selfless,
who's
empty,
totally selfless, totally empty, completely withdrawn from the world, totally blissed out, just sort of like, unattached to anything, right? And that's the hero of that thread. That's really different than the hero of the oneness thread. When I think of the oneness thread, I think of Amma, the hugging saint, who's like hugged 30 million people, and just like exudes love. I think that's like a person who many people know. I mean, maybe Jesus is an example, sort of like mythological example of the endpoint of the oneness thread, right? Just oozing oneness and oneness with God and compassion and so forth. And then you have the end of the psyche thread is these Tibetan masters that pass away, and when they pass away, their bodies dissolve into light, and there's like a rainbow going across the mountains, right? Or the Taoists who sort of like transcend the body and go up into the heavens because everything's just been turned into energy when they die, right?
This is the energy thread we're talking about. Yeah.
The energy thread, yeah. In Tibet, the energy is visualized as light, so it's rainbows. In China, it's visualized as like wispy vapor, so it goes up. They go up into heaven,
right? Rainbow body, smoke. Right.
Yeah, and so those are the heroes of the energy thread. And then in the psyche thread, depending on which version of it, you have a different, kind of hero. It could be a shaman in shamanism, or it's like a perfectly individuated person in Jungianism, or, different versions of the psyche thread, have a different hero. So for me, I think it's a lot. I think these idealized kind of mythological endpoints are actually more harmful than beneficial. I mean, they do kind of steer you in a direction to work towards. They can be inspirational, I guess, but I think what they wind up doing is just setting up kind of impossible standards that are, beyond the realm of human, right? I mean, in all of those cases, these are people who are just like, it's a little bit like, if I wanted to start swimming because I'm out of shape and I want to get to the gym and start swimming and expect that I'm going to turn into Michael Phelps, right? Like that's absurd. All I want is just to like have a decent, exercise routine that's sustainable and health to keep me healthy. I don't need to kind of like imagine myself becoming Michael Phelps, right? In order to get the value of swimming. And I think we just need to kind of like bring our expectations back into the realm of sort of reality when it comes to what we're aiming for with spirituality.
Yeah, I agree. These sort of spiritual athletes, it's fine directionally, but they can really, and again, like with YouTube and everything, where things have been kind of democratized and there's access to these people that at least put themselves on this sort of pedestal, consciously or unconsciously. I notice a lot of people feel like they're never going to get there, or they're never going to, and again, it's the same as denying threads of experience that are showing up, threads of phenomenology, and it just seems like it's just going to slow everything down. Now, with the 4 threads, there's a piece here. Maybe it's worth mentioning now about each of the threads. Kind of, if you find yourself in one, there's a certain driving question that might help propel you directionally in terms of how you attune in that thread. So for example, maybe in the emptiness thread, I've heard you speak about the question is what remains real or actual or having some substance here, and does it really? And really just kind of attuning.
Yeah, what still seems real. Yeah, so these guiding questions are questions I came up with to sort of like, no matter where you are on the thread, asking this question, or like, directing your attention, or however you want to phrase it, towards this kind of question will help you to move further down the thread. So yeah, so on the emptiness thread, it's what still seems real, right? So, wow, I just had an awakening where like the Pierce character fell away and I see that I'm awareness. Well, what still seems real? Awareness. Okay. Is that really real? Focus, is it really so? And then awareness falls away and it's like, oh, okay, now I just see there's just objects. Well, okay, the objects appear to be arising. Are they really? And then you look at that and you just go, what still seems real here, and just turn your attention towards it. Is it so? Until there's nothing left. the oneness thread, it would be, what here still seems separate. Down to the very end, there's like we were saying before, there's everything's one, but I'm here witnessing it. Right? When everything is one, then there's nothing left that's separate in any way. Moving down the energy thread, it's what still seems solid or non-dynamic, what still seems to be here. So initially it might be like, I'm having all of this energy inside my body, but the boundary of my body seems to be non-dynamic, but then the boundary of the body dissolves, and then it's like the whole field is energy, but my awareness is stable while the energy is flashing in and out. So this is still static, right? And then eventually everything becomes dynamic, non-static. And then in the psyche thread, it's what is still unwelcome or unallowed. So the psyche thread, working with the psyche thread, it's not that you come to the place where you've processed, all of the conditioning, and you understand, every last bit of the conditioning, can see, there is mythology about you see every one of your past lives, and you can see, how all of your ancestors, came together in order to form this web, or you can have experiences like that for sure. But the goal isn't to see every last bit of conditioning. The goal is to be able to set up a stance where every last bit of conditioning set up an environment where every last bit of conditioning that is seen is totally welcomed and accepted. And so when something comes up, it's not like, oh, I don't want to see that. When something new comes up, it's like, oh, you too. Okay, welcome. This is also part of the whole, I guess. I didn't realize it before, but here it is. Just in a allowing conditioning to just flow out naturally without any guardrails or any protection or any need to sort of like contain or deny or control it.
Yes, that secondary movement of control seems to relax. Yeah. Beautiful. So those are the main 4 threads. Those are the main sort of questions that might deepen in each thread. Should we talk about the braiding of the threads?
I think we're ready.
Yes. All right, man. This is a marathon. This is good. You feeling good? Do you need to pee? Is anything? You good?
I feel good so far.
Excellent.
Got my water here. I'm keeping hydrated.
I love this. I really appreciate your sharing your wisdom with everybody, because this is.
Oh no, this is fun.
It's just so much fun. Yeah, it's fascinating. And look, I recently I've ranted and raved occasionally as these sort of threads start to fall away that you can't say a word about any of this shit. So what the hell are we doing? And then.
We'll get beauty. To that. That's coming.
Oh yeah, we will. Yeah, we will get to that. The one thing I'll say is like the beauty of reality is that it constantly shows you have no idea what you're talking about. And so when we talk in this way, I feel like, okay, this is useful for myself. It's useful for a lot of people for all the reasons we talked about. So anyways, on to the braiding of the threads.
But maybe since you brought it up, we should just like insert just a reminder that the map is not the territory. What we're talking about here is a helpful framework that might be, useful for some people, not for everybody. If it doesn't resonate, if you don't like what you're hearing, if you're not, if this is too conceptual, my conditioning is as a professor, as an academic for, I've been sort of like an intellectual my whole life. That my energy is a lot sort of focused up in my head a lot, and I produce a lot of concepts and ideas, and that's just the way that this particular being is constructed and configured, and that's what I offer to the world. So if you ask me to speak about anything, that's what I'm going to give you, right? That's it. If you don't like it, that's fine. I'm not saying that this is for everybody. It's just my offering to people that I can give from this being in the way that this being is configured. This is what I can provide.
That's beautiful. And see, even that way of speaking is the acknowledgement of all the conditioning and everything that we were talking about in the psyche thread. That's how it shows up. It's like, Zubin is the same way. Zubin really loves a good fucking story and a good concept that allows a way of connecting the dots. And it's also possible here that falls away and all concepts are seen as empty constructions, in which case you can just sit. And so whatever's arising is arising and it's fine. But right now, I'm really digging this. And with all the caveats that you mentioned. So, braiding of threads.
Yes. Okay. So, you've mentioned a couple times, and I've mentioned also how in our own experience we have more than one thread opening up at different times, and so maybe some people just have one thread, and they just they have like one kind of awakening experience, and they just feel like they sink into that deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and that's it. But a lot of people have an experience more like ours with 2, 3, 4 threads maybe going. Perhaps you started off and you had a big, I don't know, I am awareness awakening, that turned into like everything is awareness. So it's like a oneness sort of awakening. And then the bottom dropped out and it all became empty. So you have this emptiness experience, and maybe then you had a Kundalini awakening. So then you start, having energy experiences. And like we were saying earlier, a lot of traditions, they're like glued into a particular thread. And so the other stuff that's happening is just kind of superfluous, or it's like a distraction. Oh, now you're having all of this like trauma coming up, Zubin. Well, that's, you'll process that and then you'll come back to your emptiness practice, right? So it's seen as sort of like superfluous kind of, stuff that's kind of distracting from the main show. In my model, the different threads are, you can have epiphenomena. Like you worked down the emptiness thread and you had a big Kundalini thing, but it didn't really develop into anything, and you just continued down the emptiness thread. Then I wouldn't call that a thread. That was just something that happened once or twice, and it didn't really amount to much. Epiphenomenal. For it to be a thread, it has to have a trajectory of deepening and end with the full, the full shebang. So many of us have more than one thread going throughout the awakening process. But when we start to experience these different threads, we have kind of a situation where one thread is on top and the other ones fade into the background, and then the next thread will come on top. And I call this braiding because you can picture, if you're picturing threads and you're making a braid, right? One braid goes on top for a while and the others are in the background, and then the next braid comes on top, right? And so you're sort of like oscillating through the threads in a way, like now I'm having emptiness, then I'm having oneness. Oh, now I'm back to having emptiness again. Now it's Kundalini, right? And it's sort of like disorienting sometimes for people. It can be very confusing. Like we were saying, you may not be in a practice community that supports a multi-threaded kind of understanding of awakening. It can be like, oh, I had all this oneness and bliss. Where did all that go? I want it back, right? It can be disorienting and confusing for a lot of people. So rather than talking in terms of stages, right? Like stage 3, 4, 5, 6, like a predictable sort of schedule for these oscillations to happen, my model just says there will be braiding. There may, in your case, there may not be braiding, or there may be very brief braiding, or there may be a very long period of time with braiding. And your braid might have 6 different nodules because you oscillated in 6 different ways, and mine might have 15 different, it's kind of like stages that I can remember oscillating. Somebody else might have 2. None of that's important. What's important is just to recognize there's a braiding process happening where these multiple threads that are open are sort of like coming forth and seeming to obscure the others, and they seem to be unintegrated and kind of like often incommensurable. Like, oh, everything's God. If you're creating ontologies, it's like, wow, everything's God, and then wow, everything's empty. What happened to God, right? And then it's like, wow, everything's energy, right? And they really don't, they can't initially really be seen as being integrated as being the same thing. There's this oscillation, then that's braiding. So it's at this point that I introduce what I call a 5th thread. It's kind of like a pseudo thread. It's not a spiritual thread. It's just a way of talking about your daily life, your work, your kids, your dog, your car, your kind of going and running errands, your ordinary kind of paying the bills, ordinary life. type stuff that I think is often part of this braid. So people might find for a while that some, spiritual thread is on top, say emptiness thread's on top, and I just really can't find any wherewithal to do any of the normal daily life stuff. And then it comes back. Maybe there's a crisis at work and I have to really like put in some serious time into that, and my spirituality kind of takes a back seat because my daily life thread is now on top. It seems unintegrated. My daily life is over here, my spirituality is over there. They're kind of in competition with each other. Then I think of that as sort of a braiding process as well.
It's so common too. You hear people talk about this all the time. My practice took a backseat because shit hit the fan over here, or vice versa. I was able to just take some time off work and just immerse in this, and this particular thread is there. Yeah, so very, very common.
Yeah, and so eventually this braiding process, given time, given attention, given sort of patience, given some skillful intervention or some skillful guidance, the process of braiding can lead into a process of integration. And so what I call integration is where these threads, including the daily life thread, start to blend in various ways. Unpredictable ways. Perhaps you have 4 threads open and these 2 start blending together, those 2 start blending together. Perhaps it's like these 3 start blending together with this one. Daily life is in the mix too. Maybe the spiritual threads integrate first and then daily life later. Maybe daily life joins the oneness thread first and then the other, who knows? It could go any which way. It's not important in my model, to create stages or create like a dogma about how this should go. It's more just to observe the fact that what tends to happen over time, if you have more than one thread open, is they tend to start to come together. They tend to start to blend into each other. And it's here that I think you find people using kind of integrative language when they're talking about their experience or their ontologies or their realities. They will say things like, I can see that all phenomena are completely empty, but also totally divine, totally sacred.
Yeah.
I can see both, that everything is this field of energy pulsating with love, right? I can see that my work and my family is the kingdom of God, where I working out, my compassion in the world or something like that, right? I can see that my all of these inner children that are coming out and all of these different aspects of myself, I can see how I can hold them all in a field of ultimate love and compassion, and how it just transforms everything into a divinity. So like language like that is suggesting the combination of these threads together. And I want to say some people, like, they jump down to integration really quickly. And so it's like, awakening happens, boom, boom, and now they're starting to integrate. Other people, this kind of integration might take a very long time. It might come, way down the road. The point isn't to, again, to create stages and a schedule. The point is just to say, I think I say in the book, the threads are, there's the same length of thread, right? From zero to like the depths where the whole entire universe is that thread. And everybody's going to braid the threads together in different ways and integrate them together in different ways. We're all walking down the same territory. It's just different pace, different ways of moving. And you're just going to, braid and integrate your threads until you're done. So as long as that takes you to do it, and you can, find helpful, skillful guidance for opening threads. You can find helpful, skillful guidance for deepening into the threads. You can also find helpful and skillful guidance for integrating the threads. You just need to kind of like, if you understand the process as a distinct process, you can then look for and find teachers who, and books and resources and traditions that focus on integration.
Yeah, or they find you, it seems. Yeah.
Or they find you.
Yeah. 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 So the way you languaged some of that as examples was really beautiful, because I could feel it. It's like, yeah, everything is, sometimes things will come out of my mouth that I'm a little surprised. Like, where is that even coming from? Like, everything is empty, but radiantly full and made of pure love. Or sometimes it shows up like, oh, I've never been in charge of any of this. This is all the sum total of everything in the universe using this, and it still feels like perfect love. Like, yeah, these things are, and it all, for me, it seems to all point back, in my own experience, to that fifth pseudo thread, which is life itself. Like, just this, it's like, yeah, this is the playground for all of this. And it's not even a conscious thing anymore. It just seems to be like, this is how it shows up. The integration seems to happen. The kind of relaxing of it seems to happen. Yeah. And it felt very intentional in the beginning, and now it feels like I don't even know if I can find intention. So really odd things. Yeah.
It can be, that dropping away of doership or of agency can happen kind of somewhere along the way. At very, for different people, maybe some people hold on to it longer than others. I kind of held on to it for a long time.
Yeah, me too. Control.
Control.
Yeah, me too. It's everything.
So at some point, this kind of like moving down the threads and the braiding and integration, at some point it kind of becomes a runaway train, right? Where you spend like months or years or decades trying to like cultivate this and move it along, and then at some point it just like boom starts going by itself, and the agency kind of just dissolves and you just surrender to the process, right? So so the threads integration, I think when I earlier gave the languaging to it, it was about sort of views of reality, right? Like everything is simultaneously totally empty, totally divine, completely alive, and also a projection of my own mind, right? Like that would be, a sort of an ontology or a worldview spoken through integration of four threads. But identity, if you still have identity at this point, identity is also, can be integrated like that. Like, I am the void. I am God. I am energy. I am a soul. And I'm also just Pierce. Like having those that integrated identity with all of those facets, and then different traditions might have different ways of kind of articulating and working with integration. So, I talked earlier about Mahayana Buddhism, where it's about sort of the integration of emptiness and compassion, right? And so they talk about, it's very common to talk about, ultimately samsara and nirvana are the same thing, right? Which is a kind of a very Buddhist way of saying that integration between those two threads. Or you have in some tantric Hindu or Buddhist systems that have chakras, you can like move your energy up into the non-dual awareness center, down into the heart center, and be connected with all things, and then further down into the body, and you get into the energy centers, right? And then down further than that, and you get into the core kind of the
root safety,
the roots of safety and so on and so forth at the core of the psyche. So just different ways of talking, different ways of articulating, different ways of working with integration. But the idea being that sort of all of the threads that are open, however many you've got, are sort of like synthesized together into a cohesive, coherent, multi-dimensional viewpoint, right? So it's like, I see now it's not all separate, phenomena and worldviews and so forth. I've integrated it all into one kind of consistent, multi-dimensional, reality and identity and viewpoint.
With a fluidity where it feels like any view can be accommodated and also seen as a view. Yeah. It's almost like the camera can move fluidly around. I used to call this, during COVID, when I was doing a lot of shows talking about integrating these different views and moral flavors, I would call it the alt-middle, this sort of radical place where you can kind of hold all views as exactly what they are. But even that's not quite right. That's putting a little conceptual spin on it.
I mean, I agree with you. I was writing some blogs, about polyperspectivalism, which is like, of course, I'm an academic, using big words, but being able to look through different lenses, kind of like sequentially or simultaneously. It's like I could put on, the emptiness glasses, I could put on the oneness glasses, I could put on the energy glasses, I can flip between the glasses, or I can just like put them all on my face at the same time and see kind of everything in this multidimensional way simultaneously, right? Kind of a certain amount of fluidity, flexibility, and multidimensionality in your perception.
Yeah, and it seems to be the inevitable sort of result of those threads kind of reaching conclusion, braiding, integrating. That seems to just show up. It's not something that you work at. Like, I'm going to work to be a little more open to different. That's not how it seems to be.
I mean, it seems to be a natural. Seems
spontaneous
to be a natural kind of spontaneous happening once the bottom of the threads have once you're close to the bottom of the threads. You don't have to be at the end. I actually, for me and a lot of people that I know, it was only after integration started that the real depths of the threads became visible.
That seems to be the case. Yeah. Like it surprises me. For me, it was the unity thread that really, after more integration happened, that the unity thread suddenly became so deep, like just to the bottom of it. Like, oh shit. A little surprising. Now that brings to if we're going to be complete, which it's always dangerous to be, but let's try. There's integration, which we just talked about, and then there's something that you call thread release.
Yeah.
And now this to me is very fascinating. We might just touch on it a bit because it might be a whole show in itself for the three people that are interested in that. But but honestly, I think it's in a way, like you were talking earlier about, the heroes of each thread look like this. So this is not setting up a hero of the multi-dharma thread model here. This is just something else that seems to happen is thread release.
Yeah.
And how do you talk about that?
Yeah. So the first thing is to say that there isn't any kind of hierarchy that's being built here. I'm just kind of going to riff on what you said for a minute, where the idea isn't that like people who go further down threads are better than people who don't. I actually think there's quite a bit of value, a tremendous amount of value for people really kind of like digging into a particular spot and really like exploring the heck out of that spot and really understanding deeply how that particular spot works. And if your specialty is opening people's emptiness thread, let's say, and that's really like you like live in that spot, helping other people to open their emptiness thread or oneness thread or whatever, that's a tremendous service that you're providing for the world, right? And I think there's absolutely no reason that anybody from any other thread, any other position on any other thread should point their finger at that person and say, you're just at the beginning, right? And that's bad. I completely disagree with that. I think we need specialists in all aspects of this model. I think we need specialists in opening threads, specialists in deepening threads. We need specialists in the emptiness thread, in the depths of the emptiness thread, who've explored that, just like we need specialists in the psyche thread who really are like masters of the underworld. And we need specialists in braiding. We need people who are, completely living in total integration and really kind of like showing the way to maximize that state. And then we have some people who, for whatever reason, are finding themselves in the thread releasing territory. And so the model, I just talk about this not as better, but just as something that can happen, just so that it's not confusing if this happens to you and you don't think you don't kind of think you've fallen off the edge of the universe. But, The releasing of the threads is, obviously the whole threads thing is a metaphor. So this is the point at which the integration has gotten so thorough, where the integration, has become so inseparable that it no longer makes any sense at all to you to hold out any of those aspects of the threads, to point to them, to even notice them in your experience, because it's become so integrated. Different metaphor, to change up the metaphor a little bit. I don't go around marveling at how integrated my arm feels with the rest of my body. Like, that's not a thought that I have, because my arm is so integrated into the rest of my body that it just is that way. And I don't have to think about it. I don't have to point it out. I don't even have to notice it. And if you tell me, Pierce, feel the integration of your arm with the rest of your body, I kind of don't know where to look to kind of like find that integration. Like, I can theoretically say, yeah, my arm's integrated with my body, but I can't feel it, because my arm has never been separate from my body. It's just like totally part of my body, and I can't find something to point to if you ask me to look for that. That's kind of a little bit of a metaphor for sort of the total integration of the threads, to the point where it no longer stands out as something to pay any attention to. And it's kind of like your brain, I don't know, your consciousness, your mind, I don't know exactly what kinds of words people are going to resonate with when I describe this, but there's just no way to find the threads anymore. There's you look for integration, you look for emptiness, you look for oneness, you can try to look for energy, but it's just it seems that it has become so completely integrated into your experience that it's just like you can't find it. Not only that, but you can't even really look for it, because the looking for it would require some kind of separation out from the integration, right? You'd have to like separate out a looker to go and like look for these qualities, and that seems like that kind of like looker can't really be found anymore. All of this is a very sort of like maybe obscure and esoteric way of saying it. The way it's actually experienced by most people that I've talked to is one of two ways. Either at the peak of integration, when everything is like, it really does feel like you're enlightened at the peak of integration. It really is like, this is enlightenment. And then suddenly one day you wake up and you just are like, it doesn't matter anymore. Like, none of it matters. I could care less about awakening. I don't even know if awakening is a thing anymore. I don't know what I was so
hung up on
all of these years. It's just completely irrelevant to me anymore, and I can just like wash my hands of it and move on. So that's one experience. The other experience is kind of like waking up one morning, and where did my enlightenment go? Like, where did my integration go? Like I want the emptiness and the fullness and the, the energy and all of this stuff, and I just can't find it anymore. It's just like poof, it's gone. And so I've talked to people who have these two different kinds of like
flavors of it,
flavors of thread release. And then by sort of investigating it a little bit further, we've come to, kind of, I've had these conversations with people, and we've come to kind of create like a list of things that seem to fall away with the dropping of a thread. So one of them is the ontologies of the thread, right? The ideas about reality based on the threads, right? Which is, so first the experience drops away. Like, I can no longer experience oneness. And then the ontology just drops away, which is like, the idea that the universe really is absolute, truth is that everything is one. That ontology kind of drops away. The identity, I am oneness, right? That we talked about earlier, even the integrated identity, I am void and God and this, that, and the other, like the identity around the thread drops away, and the thread just becomes like just meaningless. Like this, oneness. It's kind of like I watched a movie 10 years ago about it. I can kind of remember a little bit of a hazy detail, but it's sort of not really relevant anymore. And so I think this is what you've been talking about on your YouTube channel for the last couple of months, but different people express it differently, and different people kind of have a different, sometimes people react the way I think you have been, which is like, oh, spirituality is all bullshit, right? Like that's a common, oh my God, I finally realized it's all bullshit. That's a common reaction. Another kind of reaction, more my kind of reaction, is just like, oh, the whole thing that seemed to be real, turns out it was all an overlay. It was always overlays that I was placing on things. It was always something that I was adding to the picture, and that is no longer needed to add. Even when it seemed like I was seeing truth as it really is, there was still like a emptiness overlay or a oneness overlay or something that was being applied to experience. So let me stop there, and you see how much deeper you want to go.
It's so funny as you're talking. I'm just giggling because this is how the experience is arising here, and I had no container for this until you and I spoke, and I was like, oh, that's really what it is. Like there is this feeling that it's almost just an ordinariness that seems to arise, that everything is just collapsed into what is. And there's nothing really that needs to be said about it. We don't need to mentally masturbate over it. And yet, it's funny because then I can recognize there's part of Zubin's conditioning that really fucking digs these conceptual sort of frameworks that help us, understand. And that can arise. But it isn't felt in the same way. Like you say, you go looking for this oneness thread and you just can't even look. You can't even separate enough to find it. And then the whole worldview around it collapses. Like you said, it's like, I don't fucking know what reality is. It's this. And yet, so then they might ask the question, why then? Why even allow this unfolding of threads and take it seriously at all? Why take it earnestly or sincerely? And there's another piece here that's very hard to talk about, which is, it seems like everything is just as it is now, in a way that it's almost impossible to remember what it was like before, but there's no going back to how reality was perceived before. So it's a way of saying, I wouldn't have it any other way. And yet it's so ordinary. Like, it's like you said, the arm's integrated with the body. You wouldn't even notice it. And it puts you in a strange position if you've been making videos for a long time about anything along these lines, because you want to say it's all bullshit and you guys just go on and live your lives. But we know from our own unfolding that that's not how it worked here. Yeah. So yeah, it's very paradoxical, strangely simple, and less am I trying to figure it out. And more I'm just like, yeah, I guess that's how it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of this on the fly, but this metaphor I was saying about my arm, it's as if maybe like, I don't know if this makes any sense, but I had some condition in my arm, and I was living with it, with some low level pain, sometimes like sharp pain in my arm. I had my arm amputated, and now it's like a robotic arm. That's the awakening process. And I've just been spending so much time just like paying attention to this arm, and like, wow, it's so cool. It's got all these powers. I can lift things that I could never do before. And look how pain-free everything is. And it's just amazing. Look, I'm learning all these new skills, I can do with this arm. And then eventually, like, it's so integrated that it's like, I've completely forgotten, I've completely forgotten that I had the pain in the first place. I'm forgetting to check and notice how integrated this new arm is. It's just I'm just getting on with life. I'm just sort of living ordinary. I'm not paying attention to this arm at all. Until somebody comes up to me and asks like, "Hey, how's your your new arm?" And then I can sort of notice like, yeah, it's pretty integrated, and the pain that I used to feel isn't there anymore. But it's not. I don't really need to go around noticing or talking about it all the time. I don't know if this is a good metaphor or not.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's good because you would have to strain a bit to remember what your organic arm was like. Like well, that felt a certain way, but it's very hard to actually even bring it up because what is even happening there? And the new integrated robotic arm is just so seamless. I think that's a good metaphor. Again, we're speaking only in these kind of metaphors because what else is there to do? It's kind of like, well, we go back to living our lives because what else is there to do? And so, I find myself expressing in a certain way, which is you don't get out of this through all this. You get back to this like fully where you could never have left. It's like, yeah, okay, now it's on with the business of being alive.
I tend to use... I tend to use less attractive language than most people. Like I've heard other people talk about liberation and talk about freedom from suffering and blah blah blah.
Right.
I tend to use less sexy language, and so one of the things I like to say, a little bit tongue in cheek, is you're asleep, and then you have your whole awakening process, and then you go back to sleep. Because it's like you don't have to sit. You no longer are like focused in any way on any of the things that the threads were all about. So you're no longer focused on seeing emptiness or experiencing emptiness or oneness or energy. You're no longer really focused on having any kind of like practices that like generate different mental states, different kinds of spiritual states and so forth. So you just kind of like go to work and, feed your dogs and just
pay your taxes,
live your life. And it's just kind of super, super ordinary. But the thing that I think has been sort of like filtered out through this process of awakening, I think the by filtering out the ontologies and the identities, you've filtered out all the spiritual ontologies and identities, but you've also filtered out kind of like all ontologies and identities, and
every way things are.
Yeah. So there's really no particular way that things, are, and there's really no particular kind of like identity that needs to be taken. And I think as a byproduct of that, you do have a significant reduction in the second order suffering that people produce for themselves by attaching to ontologies and identities, right? So, you've just as much pain in the body. There's just as much, like unpleasant situations in life, and there's just as much, kind of ordinary unpleasantness or suffering, you could say, as any other being has. But there just doesn't seem to be all of the second order kind of attachments to what this means and what it means for me and how this would, what this means on a grand scale, and how people are going to perceive this and so on and so forth. There's all these kind of other kind of mental loops and thought processes that don't seem to be there anymore. So it's different.
It's an absence. It is different. Yeah. And it is like that. And, people will say, well, do you experience illness or pain or those sort of things? And it's like, yeah, in fact, you can't, it used to be I could meditate a space of detachment where that was experienced as nothing but an energetic flux or empty phenomena radiating into and out of existence and just felt as energy. Now it's like, no, it's just pain. Like it's just full on. That's what it is. But there isn't, like you said, there isn't the second order arrow of, oh shit, what's it going to be like in 10 minutes? Oh my God, what does this mean for me and my story and my life? What's the cause and the etiology of all? It doesn't even matter. It's just like, nope, it's pain now.
Yeah.
And then the next thing. Yeah.
I mean, the thing, the way that I sort of perceive this in myself, and I don't know if this is necessarily the way everybody sort of would describe it, but what I perceived was that there had always been a kind of an extra thought loop running on top of experience, saying, well, first of all, like noticing the experience, like reflecting, like a mirror, kind of reflecting the experience back. So the sound would happen, and there's like a registering of the sound, or the body sensation would happen, and there's like a registering of the body sensation, and then a thought loop that's sort of like, liking and disliking those experiences, and kind of like trying to control or manipulate the next moment to get, what it wants, or what it wants more of, or what it wants less of. And there's sort of like a little bit of a kind of a thought loop there. And then a thought loop that's kind of like taking credit for things like, I did that. I got this because I did that. Or a reading of whether or not reality was successfully controlled, and this kind of like reinforcement that, yes, that was good, or like, ooh, I got to do better next time. So these like extra thought loops running on top of experience that were kind of like constantly monitoring and trying to control what was happening, and those seem to be gone. And so there's just kind of like, I can't even say there's experiencing, because one of those thought loops that's no longer there is the mirror that kind of like was reflecting experience. I can't even say experience is really there, or not. But there doesn't seem to be all of that extra energy, extra kind of like processing that taking place. It just seems like that sort of, those apps were like deleted from the system, and the result is it's, I don't know if that's right. It doesn't, there seems to be more energy, efficiency in the system without all of that sort of like extra thought loops. Cause it seems like those extra thought loops were taking up a lot of bandwidth. And with those sort of dropping off, it just seems things flow a little bit more, cleanly, a little bit more, fluidly, kind of like, flow state when an athlete or a musician kind of gets into a flow state, and they're just like acting from instinct without all the sort of like extra thinking, and then it's like they perform some kind of beautiful, like miraculous, feat, and everybody's like, wow, that's amazing, like how did you do that? And they're like, I don't know, I don't even think I was there when I did it, I just sort of like, my body just did it. And so it kind of feels like that, just like all the time. Just the body kind of running on this sort of autopilot, just doing its thing fluidly without all the excess sort of monitoring and controlling functions.
Yeah. For here, I can say that's often how it's experienced. And then every now and again, that secondary loop will activate.
Yeah.
And it becomes the loudest thing in the room. Like it's like, oh, because it had been gone. And yeah.
So that's important. That's why I talk about this as a process and not a stage, right? So just like all the other stages, just like all the other things that we've been talking about, that I was saying, these aren't stages with a schedule where it's like, okay, now you're in, congratulations,
Nirvana land.
Now you're a thread dropper, right?
Sounds
you
vaguely
the boundary, and you're a thread dropper, right? It's a process. So like at some point the threads start to drop. They start to fall away, and it might happen rather suddenly. It might happen rather flamboyantly. For me, it was kind of like just kind of quiet and sort of like, oh, poof, like they just kind of disappeared. Little bit of a relaxation, and that was kind of it. But it's not like 100% gone all at once. It's like, maybe like, I don't know, 70% gone, 80% gone. And then there's like for me, it was like a kind of a, maybe like a 70-80% disappeared all at once. It was kind of a general sense of relaxation. But then there's a long tail, right? Where the other 20-30% is sort of like, I don't know, I'm just making up those numbers. But it's like just a visual to visualize, a 80% reduction, a big reduction, and then like a long tail of just like, working through, some things as they reemerge and as the threads get taken back up again. I made a joke. It's kind of like you were holding the thread and then dropped it, but you realized the thread landed on your shirt or landed on your lap, and you're like, oops, hold on a second, I pick that back up again. Or,
Yeah. It's surprising, like, because you think you can't even imagine it, and then all of a sudden there's an energy thread that got picked up, and it's experienced in a certain way. In some sense, it's different. Well, actually, in every sense. Yeah, I don't know. Now it becomes impossible to talk about, so I'm going to stop. But yeah, it is. It's rather. It's funny because I can see some of the audience members who are just trying to figure out, okay, so what is it in the post-thread drop state that is different from, and it's really, you talked about it very well, that secondary loop isn't there. The way that shows up for me is I like the word autopilot that you use here. It's like the conditioning is allowed to be the conditioning, and yet there's this very subtle level of it's really more that's what's not there, that you're not pushing and pulling on that or evaluating it or trying it to have it other. And that allows a kind of freedom that actually even self-modifies the conditioning. So it's really hard to show up in a way that is overtly harmful to other people or to yourself. That's how it seems to show up here. And when it does happen, it creates this kind of feedback loop that's kind of felt. And I don't know if that's the integration of this kind of oneness idea, but it's just natural, spontaneous. And it's not perfect. It's not perfect at all. And yeah.
So I do, like I said before, I like to use terms that maybe aren't so sexy and aren't so attractive to describe, because I don't want to set up this kind of like, hierarchy.
This carrot. And the hierarchy. Yeah.
But just to kind of like we're just trying to put words around something, of course, that's very challenging to talk about. But I do use this concept of autopilot because, for me, kind of like to play out that metaphor a little bit, it's kind of like, I used to think I was the pilot flying the plane, and through understanding conditioning and how, in the process of the psyche thread, discovering how much of the plane was actually being driven by conditioning, right? It wasn't me driving anything. It was all conditioning in the end. I felt more like the little kid with the fake steering wheel sitting, in the back seat, pretending to drive when actually, mom's driving, right? So it's like conditioning was driving the flying the plane all along. I just kind of this thought loop was telling me that I was doing something, that, that I was in charge of something, and it turns out I was in charge of nothing. And so when you drop the thread, it's like you've dropped the identity or the delusion or the whole concept that you could be in charge of flying the plane. The plane is flying itself. It has a pretty skillful autopilot machine that responds to negative stimulus, right? Like the plane can correct for altitude and turbulence, right? So like, this unit, this autopilot, this body, this being, however you want to talk about it, whatever language you want to use, goes about life doing things. And if there's a mistake made, if there's like negative feedback from the whole room full of people are like, Pierce, my God, what are you talking about? There's some kind of like physical stimulus, some kind of social stimulus, any kind of signals that are negative, like the autopilot can correct for that. You don't need to produce a self with an identity and an ontology who assumes control of the plane and thinks that they're flying the plane in order to fix that, right? So
yeah,
it just, everything kind of happens naturally within the flow state, within the autopilot. Like you don't need to snap out of it in order to like, manage things. Although there's still a habit of snapping out of it occasionally, given certain situations, in certain kind of contexts. You might have a habit of snapping out and being like, oh, I need to seize control here, right? Or something like that. But increasingly over time, it seems like when those things happen, like, oh, I need to take control. I need to be in charge. I need to be a self. I need to have a worldview. Simultaneously, there's sort of like I just know that's not possible.
Yeah, it's just not possible. It
kind of collapses.
Right? Can't even do it. Yeah. I think that's it's beautifully said. It actually beautifully describes why it's so hard to talk about, because in order to talk about it, you almost have to create this construction of someone who's having an experience, who's doing these things, and it doesn't feel possible easily to do that. So it's like, yeah, it's just this. Yeah, it's just
so. Yeah, to go with the autopilot metaphor. I used to think I was a pilot. Now the autopilot's flying, but the realization is there is actually no pilot. There's actually nobody sitting in the cockpit with the autopilot. There just was the thought that there was a pilot that could fly the plane is gone, and so there's just there's nobody in the cockpit, right? That thinks it's separate from the plane, that thinks it could control it, that thinks it could be flying it. There's nobody there to do that. So then I don't know if we're getting this across well or not, but the threads all turn out to be perspectives or viewpoints that could be taken, right? That could be taken to describe what's going on, right? So when there isn't the need to monitor reality, to explain what's happening, to watch it, or to kind of like formulate thoughts and opinions about it, then all of the threads are seen to just always, they were always just overlays. They were always just kind of like filters used in order to sort of like apprehend and try to grasp onto and try to understand something. And when there's no viewer, there's no perspective taker, the perspectives are all seen to have been like
fabrications,
sort of fabrications. Yeah. And so all of the whole of spirituality, the whole awakening process, the entire thing from beginning to end turns out to have been an overlay, turns out to have been a superfluous kind of like self-created kind of illusory sort of like overlay that you placed onto reality. It was very necessary, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was necessary to be able to extract out of the narrative self and to, have learned all of these things. I'm sure it's necessary to take some kind of perspectives, and some perspectives are more helpful than others. And so these perspectives can be taught, I think, as like skillful practices for people to take on. I think it's better to have a perspective of oneness than it is to have a perspective of like, material greed and higher, dominator hierarchies and, and whatever, right? I think it's better, probably to have, not in an objective sense, but in,
right. In a relative,
relative sense. I think these frameworks, these spiritual frameworks, can be helpful, can be beneficial, can be taught, can be learned, can be practiced, can be taken seriously. But I would always want to add, let's not make it into an ontology. Let's not take the map to be the territory. Let's not create fundamentalist religions around these perspectives if we're going to drop them in the end, right? Like we can do all of this much more lightly than I think people have been doing.
Beautifully said. That's a great wrap up of this whole thing, because it's almost like, and I'll quote one particular tradition, whether it's the Diamond Sutra or the Heart Sutra or the 10th ox herding picture, they basically say, remember all this stuff we were talking about all this awakening stuff? It's all provisional, right? Like there's really nothing happening here. Like it's just this. And the final ox herding picture is like the dude in the market chilling. Yeah.
Exactly. Go back to the marketplace, right? With gift bestowing hands, like just kind
Gift
of being
bestowing hands.
being helpful. And I would put like the rest of that line for me would be, you know, and he never thought about spirituality again. Or something like that, you know?
Exactly. And it's you know, and in sort of closing this up, Pierce, for this particular discussion, which was fantastic, by the way, thank you. Like, I have to thank you because it's so easy, because this is such an odd place to be sometimes when threads start to integrate and drop, and it can feel like a kind of wholesale rejection sometimes of the whole enterprise. And that's how it arose here. It was a general frustration with like, why are we still talking about this? Like, it all felt fixative. Like there was a fixation in spirituality, that there was a misleading component of it, that you know, ultimately when it starts to relax. But now it's seen much more along the lines of what you're saying, which is, yeah, I think that probably was necessary. Like, you kind of do need that to get out of this narrative self. And it is, and people are suffering in that way. And you can feel it when you talk to them. And so it's nice to have a framework that can allow so much space and so much understanding and so much directionality that people can unfold in the way that they're going to unfold. And I think that is a central thing. And ultimately, if thread release happens or doesn't happen, it doesn't even matter, because it is the unfolding as it's going, and there's nothing really to do about it. So it's really, really perfectly beautiful.
Yeah. I just was gonna say, I you know, because I've talked to many people who have been through this kind of like thread release process, and that kind of recoiling from spirituality is definitely a common theme. And another common theme is people having grief around it. Like where did my, you know, beautiful, perfect kind of like pure land of you know, the world that I created for myself, you know, in this enlightened integrated stage, like I miss it, and you know, and you lose a lot of kind of you lose the ability to kind of like take, by losing the ability to take things seriously and really immerse in them, you lose a lot of the beautiful kind of like amazing phenomenology of awakening, right? You can't like drop into this like warm-hearted, like, you know, intimacy. You can't drop into this, you know, really crisp sort of you know, you can't drop into the energy fields and so on and so forth. You lose a lot of you lose, and some people respond to that with grief and wishing that it would have gone on longer and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, just different kinds of you know, perspectives and attachments and kind of you know, bumps in the road happen, you know, around this thread release, which is why it's a process. It's not that's
right. It's not a one and done
deal.
Yeah. It's funny. I was recently, I met with someone I haven't seen in, you know, 20 years, and they were, you know, they're not particularly on any spiritual path, but you could tell they're waking up from the narrative self in this very particular middle-aged way. And so, as tends to happen, like we started talking, and I started pointing to what my experience is like now and the kind of process that it had been. And it was clear that they were recoiling at how I experienced the world. And they're like, so wait, so there's no wow at like the kind of synchronicities that seem to happen and this and this? Like, no, not really. Like that occurred. I certainly saw that. But now it's just very like, yeah, there's no reason for a wow. There's just this happening. And it was almost like they were grieving for the life and the abilities that I had that had clearly fallen away. But I didn't feel that. What I felt was like, yeah, it's all good. Yeah, it's just as it is. Yeah. It's interesting.
It's just whatever it is enough. There doesn't need to be the extra overlays that make it into, you know, something spectacular or something terrible.
Yeah,
it just kind of is.
That's right.
Is. Yeah,
that's right. That's perfectly said. Popeye, right? I am what I am. It is what it is. Pierce, anything else to add before we wrap up? We've gone like 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was fun. I feel energized and, not
Me too.
not at all like it dragged on.
Good. Let's go another 5 then.
We'll maybe come back and
another time.
We can do some other exploration another time. But
yeah,
no, I thought this was great. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to sort of like lay out the whole model in detail, because I think it takes some time to lay it all out, and so this was nice open runway for which I could do that. So I really appreciate it.
I love it. And so we'll link to your book to multidharma.net, and then people can go further to the degree that they feel called. And then leave us a comment. If you're on Spotify on audio podcast, you can put it in the Spotify podcast stuff. If you're watching on YouTube, leave it in the comments. Like, what would you like to see Pierce and I talk about in depth in any of these models, particularly if you go to his website and take a look? Is there a particular thread you want us to dive into more? Do you want us to talk about any other aspects of this? I'm sure Pierce would, hopefully, I'm speaking for him, I shouldn't, if he came to do it, but
be happy to.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. Yeah. And the other thing I just want to say is, like, the punchline of all of this, I hope, for people who are watching who are feeling stuck or a little hopeless, sometimes these things can arise. I know I was there. It's like, yeah, it's okay. Like, this has room for all experience and non-experience that might arise, including the dropping of it all. So it's all going to be just exactly as it is. And that's actually a huge relief for me. It was. So that said, Pierce, thanks again. And we are out. Peace.
Yeah. Thank you, Zubin.
Thanks.